Listen closely, and I'll tell you something they don't teach in those fluorescent-lit psychology classrooms, something that crawls beneath the skin of every love song ever written. There's an old Serbian folktale about a vila, a mountain fairy who appears to lonely shepherds as the most beautiful woman they've ever seen. She dances with them under the stars, her laughter like silver bells, her touch like silk, warmed by candlelight. But here's what the old women whisper when the young men aren't listening. The vila doesn't love. She feeds on attention, on desire, on the very essence of masculine longing. And when the shepherd is finally drained, when his eyes go hollow and his songs fall silent, she simply vanishes, back to the mountains, back to waiting for the next lonely soul. Schopenhauer saw it first, that grim old bachelor hunched over his manuscripts while his poodles slept at his feet. Love, he wrote, his pen scratching against parchment like fingernails on coffin wood, is the consciousness of the species asserting itself over the individual. But he was being polite. What he really meant was this: that smile across the candlelit restaurant table, that flutter of eyelashes, that soft hand reaching for yours. It's not romance, it's appetite. Have you ever watched a spider spin her web in the corner of a dusty library? The precision is breathtaking, each strand placed with mathematical perfection, invisible until the light hits just right. The spider doesn't hate the fly. She doesn't even think about the fly. She simply is, and her nature is hunger dressed in geometric beauty. A 2024 study from the University of Zurich found that during the early stages of romantic attraction, the same neural pathways activate as those triggered by cocaine addiction. The researchers called it nature's cruelest joke, making destruction feel like salvation. But here's where it gets interesting, where the candlelight flickers and throws strange shadows on the wall. The hunger isn't evil. Evil requires intention, and intention requires consciousness of choice. No, this is something far more terrifying. It's innocent. She doesn't know she's feeding. She thinks she's loving. She believes her own performance because she must, because to see through her own illusion would be to stare into an abyss that would swallow her whole. I once knew a man, let's call him Thomas, who fell in love with a woman who collected broken things. Cracked teacups, three-legged chairs, wounded birds with bent wings. Her apartment smelled of dust and lavender, and she had this way of tilting her head when she listened, as if your words were the most precious things she'd ever heard. Thomas thought he'd found his savior, his angel of mercy. It took him 3 years to realize she didn't fix broken things. She needed them broken. The moment his wounds began to heal, the moment he stood a little straighter, smiled a little broader, that's when her eyes began to wander. That's when new broken things appeared on her shelves. The ancient Greeks had a word, agape, divine love, selfless and pure. But they also had eros. And if you dig deep enough into those crumbling texts, past the sanitized translations, you'll find that eros was never about love at all. It was about consumption. The god Eros didn't bring people together. He set them on fire and watched them burn. Do you feel it yet? That uncomfortable shifting in your chest? That's recognition. Because you've been the shepherd on the mountain. You've danced with the Vila. You've sat across from that tilted head and those understanding eyes and felt yourself being delicately, lovingly devoured. Here's what they don't tell you about hunger. It's honest. A wolf doesn't pretend to be vegetarian, but wrap that wolf in a wedding dress, teach it to waltz, spray it with French perfume, and suddenly you're slow dancing with your own destruction, convincing yourself that those teeth against your neck are kisses. 2025 meta-analysis of relationship patterns found that men who score high on emotional availability and investment consistently partner with women who subconsciously seek validation through emotional distance. The researchers called it complementary dysfunction. I call it dinner time. The real tragedy isn't the feeding. It's the mythology we build around it. Romeo and Juliet, a 13-year-old girl and a boy who loved another woman 3 pages earlier, destroying 2 families in a weekend. Tristan and Isolde, a story of betrayal dressed up as destiny. We polish these tales until they gleam, hang them in museums, teach them to our children. We make hunger holy. So here's my question for you, whispered in the dark like a secret you shouldn't hear. When was the last time you felt truly seen? Not desired, not needed, not wanted, but seen. And when she looked at you with those hungry eyes, mistaking appetite for affection, did part of you prefer the beautiful lie to the ugly truth? Because here's the thing about spiders and villas and women who collect broken things. They're not the villains of this story. They're just nature, doing what nature does. The villain, if there is one, is the shepherd who sees the mountain fairy for what she is and dances anyway, because even being devoured feels better than being alone. There's a Victorian photograph in the Museum of Morning Arts, you know the kind, where the living pose with their dead, propping corpses in chairs like dinner guests who've overstayed their welcome. The strangest part isn't the bodies. It's the faces of the living, frozen in a smile that says, everything is perfectly normal. Uncle Theodore always sits like that. I'll tell you when love dies. It's not in the screaming matches or the shattered plates. It's in a Tuesday afternoon, 3:47 p.m., when she's talking about her coworker's new dog and you realize you're counting ceiling tiles. It's the moment you catch yourself performing enthusiasm like a trained seal, barking on cue. How interesting, darling. Tell me more about the schnauzer. Kierkegaard wrote about the sickness unto death. Not physical death, but the spiritual gangrene that sets in when we choose comfort over authenticity. He was talking about faith, but he might as well have been describing modern relationships. We've become morticians of love, applying makeup to corpses, arranging dead flowers in crystal vases, spraying formaldehyde perfume to mask the stench of decay. I once attended a dinner party in Munich, candlelight reflecting off crystal, Wagner whispering from hidden speakers. The kind of evening where everyone pretends their marriage isn't a mausoleum. The hostess, let's call her Ingrid, kept touching her husband's arm. Little touches, rehearsed, like a pianist hitting the same dead key, hoping this time it might sing. Her husband smiled each time, the same smile, frame by frame, identical. They'd been performing this duet for 17 years. After the 3rd bottle of wine, Ingrid's mask slipped. Do you know what Andreas gave me for our anniversary? She laughed, the sound like glass breaking in velvet. A cookbook for Mediterranean cuisine. She drew out the word like an accusation. I am allergic to oregano. Here's what the relationship experts won't tell you in their TED Talks and couples retreats. Every love story is also a ghost story. The moment you say, I love you, you're already writing the obituary. A 2023 study from Copenhagen tracked cortisol levels in long-term couples and found something disturbing. The stress hormones spike not during fights, but during ordinary conversations. The body knows what the mind won't admit. You're sharing breakfast with a ghost. But we're talented morticians, aren't we? We've invented 1,000 ways to make the dead seem alive. Date nights, scheduled spontaneity, what an oxymoron. Couples vacations, changing the scenery around the corpse. Sex that feels like a reenactment of sex. Bodies going through remembered motions while minds drift to grocery lists and deadline pressures. We've turned intimacy into taxidermy. The Japanese have a word, ikizukuri, the preparation of sashimi from living fish, arranged so the fish appears alive on the plate, eyes still moving, gills still gasping, while diners eat its flesh. Cruel? Perhaps. But at least it's honest about what it is. We do the same thing with love, but we pretend the fish is swimming. You want to know the exact moment? Listen for the silence between words, not comfortable silence. That's different. That's two people who've learned to exist without performance. No, I mean the silence that screams, the pause where you both realize there's nothing left to say, but neither wants to admit it. It's the silence that makes you turn on the television. That makes you check your phone. That makes you suggest another bottle of wine. Nietzsche declared God dead, but he missed the more intimate funeral. Every living room has become a wake where the mourners refuse to acknowledge the body on the couch. We binge-watch Netflix series like pallbearers sharing memories of the deceased. Remember when we used to talk until sunrise? Remember when your laugh didn't sound rehearsed? Remember when we were alive? A fascinating 2024 neurological study from Stockholm found that the brain processes a dying relationship exactly like grief. The same regions light up. The same chemicals flood the system. But here's the cosmic joke. We grieve while pretending to celebrate. It's like sobbing at a funeral while insisting it's a birthday party. The old fairy tales knew this secret. Sleeping Beauty isn't about a princess waking up. It's about everyone pretending she was never asleep. Snow White in her glass coffin, lips still red, skin still white. The dwarfs weren't waiting for a prince. They were content to worship a beautiful corpse. But here's where it gets deliciously dark. Sometimes, dead love is more comfortable than living alone. A corpse doesn't judge, doesn't demand, doesn't challenge you to grow. You can project whatever you want onto those glassy eyes. You can have entire conversations where you play both parts. You can finally win every argument. I knew a man who kept his wedding ring on for 7 years after the love died. Not after the divorce. That came later. 7 years of wearing a monument to something that had stopped breathing. When I asked him why, he said, "It's easier than explaining." But explaining to whom? The strangers at coffee shops? or himself? So let me ask you something, and I want you to sit with this like you'd sit with a corpse at a wake. What are you pretending not to smell? What death are you dressing up in Sunday clothes? And when you kiss her goodnight, or him, or them, or whoever shares your mortuary, do you taste formaldehyde? Because here's the secret the morticians know. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for the dead is bury them. And sometimes the cruelest thing you can do to yourself is pretend they're still dancing. At 3 a.m. in Prague, I once watched a man build a cathedral out of matchsticks in his apartment window. 4 stories up, hunched over his kitchen table, placing each tiny wooden bone with the precision of a surgeon or a madman. His neighbors called him Cherny Mnik, the Black Monk. 6 years he'd been at it. 6 years of Friday nights alone, of Christmas dinners for one, of conversations with no one but the slowly growing spires of his matchstick Notre Dame. They pitied him, those neighbors. Poor Pavel, they'd whisper in the stairwell, their voices thick with the smugness of the coupled. But I climbed those stairs one November night, knocked on his door with a bottle of Becherovka, and the kind of desperation that makes strangers trust each other. You know what I found? Not loneliness. Something far more terrifying: contentment. People think solitude is empty, Pavel said, his fingers never stopping their delicate work. But empty of what? Of their noise? Their needs? Their endless, exhausting performance? He held up a matchstick, examined it like a jeweler with a suspect diamond. I used to be married, 12 years. You know what I remember most? The sound of her disappointment. It had a frequency, like tinnitus. Even when she smiled, I could hear it. Schopenhauer, patron saint of the willingly alone, compared human relationships to porcupines huddling for warmth. Too close, and we wound each other with our quills. Too far, and we freeze. But what if the cold isn't the enemy? What if the shivering is just your body remembering how to generate its own heat? Here's what they don't print in the self-help books with their sunset covers and scripted affirmations. Solitude is the only place where the lies stop working. No audience means no performance. No mirror held up by another's expectations. Just you and the humming silence, face to face, with the stranger you've been avoiding your whole life. A 2025 longitudinal study from the Institute of Human Dynamics in Vienna found something the researchers didn't expect. Men who spent significant time in voluntary solitude showed increased activity in the brain's default mode network, the same regions that light up during deep meditation and creative breakthroughs. But here's the part they buried in the footnotes. These men also reported a phenomenon they couldn't quite name. One subject called it the horror of clarity, another, meeting God and realizing it's just yourself. The ancient desert fathers knew this secret. They fled to the Egyptian wilderness not to escape temptation, but to confront the tempter, themselves. No bread in circuses out there in the sand. No soft bodies to distract from the hard questions. Just you and the voice you've been drowning out with dinner parties and dating apps and the desperate puppet show of social media. I'll tell you something about that matchstick cathedral. It wasn't pretty. Up close, you could see the burnt heads, the crooked spires, the places where Pavel's hands had shaken from too much wine or too little sleep. But it was his. every flaw, every imperfection, every collapsed wall rebuilt with stubborn patience. It was the most honest thing I'd ever seen. A prayer made of wood and glue and time spent not performing love, but discovering it. You want to know the difference between loneliness and solitude? Loneliness is drinking wine while scrolling through your ex's Instagram. Solitude is drinking wine while reading Marcus Aurelius and realizing you agree with a dead Roman emperor more than any living person you know. Loneliness is an empty bed that feels like failure. Solitude is an empty bed that feels like possibility. There's a Japanese concept, hikikomori, the ones who withdraw completely from society. The West treats it like a disease, sends therapists and social workers to coax them back into the performance. But what if they're not sick? What if they're the only sane ones, refusing to play a game where everyone loses but pretends to win? But here's where it gets interesting, where the candlelight casts shadows that dance like dervishes. True solitude isn't about hiding. It's about finally showing up. When Pascal said all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone, he wasn't advocating for hermitage. He was diagnosing our terror of self-encounter. I knew a woman, brilliant physicist, published in all the right journals, who took a vow of silence for a year, not in a monastery, in her Manhattan apartment. She'd go to work, nod and smile, communicate through written notes. Her colleagues thought she'd lost her mind, but she told me later, writing on a yellow legal pad in her kitchen while sirens wailed outside, I wanted to hear what I sounded like without the echo of other people's expectations. What she heard horrified her, then fascinated her, then finally freed her. The cathedral builders of medieval times often never saw their work completed. Generations of stonecutters laboring in anonymity, crafting gargoyles that would leer at citizens not yet born. They didn't build for applause or recognition. They built because the building itself was the prayer. Pavel's matchstick cathedral burned down 3 months after my visit. Electrical fire. Mundane end to a magical thing. His neighbors expected him to be devastated. Instead, they found him at his kitchen table the next morning, opening a fresh box of matches, starting again. Smiling the way only the truly alone can smile, without trying to convince anyone of anything. So, here's my question, whispered like a confession in an empty church. What would you build if no one was watching? What truth would you tell if there was no one to impress, no one to disappoint, no one to perform for? And when you're lying in bed tonight, in that moment before sleep, when all the masks slip off, who is that person staring back at you from the darkness? Because that's the real horror story. Not that we're alone, but that we've never met ourselves. We're strangers wearing our own faces, reading scripts written by people who don't even know our names. In Kyoto, there's a temple where they repair broken pottery with gold. Kintsugi, they call it, the art of precious scars. But here's what the tourist brochures don't mention. The monks sometimes break perfect bowls on purpose. Late at night, when the moon is dark and the city sleeps, they take hammers to flawless porcelain. Because perfection, they whisper, is the ugliest lie we tell. I met her at a conference on behavioral psychology, the kind where everyone wears badges and pretends their own behavior isn't the most disturbing case study in the room. Dr. Sarah Chen, 3 PhDs, published in Nature, the kind of woman who irons her lab coats. She gave a presentation on optimizing human potential through systematic flaw correction. 47 slides of graphs and charts about fixing what's broken in the human condition. During the Q&A, I asked her about her missing finger. The room went silent. That particular silence that sounds like a record scratch in reality. Her left hand, she'd kept it hidden the entire presentation, a masterclass in misdirection. But I'd noticed. You always notice what people try to hide. Childhood accident, she said, her voice steady as a flat line. Then, something shifted. A crack in the porcelain. Actually, no. That's what I usually say. Truth is, I bit it off. Age 7. Anxiety disorder. They tried to fix me. Therapy, medication, behavioral modification. Fixed everything except the part that was actually interesting. She held up her four-fingered hand then, really held it up, like a torch or a trophy. This, she said, is the only honest thing about me. Everything else is performance improvement. Nietzsche wrote that we must become who we are, but he didn't mention that who we are is usually a glorious disaster. A 2024 study from the Karolinska Institute found that people with perfectly symmetrical faces, the mathematical ideal of beauty, triggered an uncanny valley response in observers. Too perfect, too polished, like mannequins pretending to breathe. But show someone a crooked smile, a scarred eyebrow, eyes that don't quite match. Suddenly, the brain relaxes. Human, its size, real. We've built an entire civilization on the lie of improvement. Self-help seminars in hotel ballrooms that smell like industrial carpet and broken dreams. Life coaches with perfect teeth selling you the blueprint to become someone else. Dating profiles where everyone hikes and loves adventure and has their shit together. We've turned existence into a renovation project. But what if the house was supposed to be haunted? I know a man who stutters. Not sometimes, always. Every word, a small war between thought and tongue. He could have fixed it. Therapy was offered, techniques taught. He refused. My stutter, he told me over whiskey that took him full minutes to order, is my bullshit detector. The people who wait for me to finish, those are the ones worth knowing. It's like having a bouncer for my soul. The ancient Greeks had two words for time, chronos and kairos. Chronos is clock time, the merciless march of minutes. Kairos is the perfect moment, the fullness of now. But here's what they didn't say. Kairos only exists because Chronos is broken. The perfect moment is always the imperfect one, the crack where light gets in. Your damage is your signature. That anxiety that makes you triple-check locks, that's not a bug. It's the same system that makes you notice when someone's smile doesn't reach their eyes. That depression that pulls you under, it's the same depth that lets you understand Dostoevsky, while others think he's just dark. Your broken pieces aren't obstacles to happiness. They're the source material. But we're addicted to sandpaper, aren't we? Grinding down our edges until we're smooth as river stones. Forgetting that smooth stones don't hold on to anything. They just roll wherever the current takes them. A 2025 meta-analysis of personality modification therapies found a disturbing correlation. The more successfully people eliminated their negative traits, the higher their rates of what researchers delicately called existential emptiness. Turns out, when you fix everything broken about yourself, you're left with nothing at all. In medieval times, they believed in memento mori. Remember, you must die. Monks kept skulls on their desks, not from morbidity, but from clarity. The skull grins because it knows the secret. All your improvement projects end the same way. 6 feet under. Perfected and broken all become equal. The only question is whether you lived as yourself or as your own renovation project. I once loved a woman who collected her mistakes like others collect stamps. She had a journal, leather-bound, pages thick as promises, where she wrote down every wrong turn, every failed relationship, every moment of spectacular human messiness. My museum of beautiful damage, she called it. She'd read entries aloud sometimes, laughing at her former selves with the tenderness you'd show old photographs. She left me, of course. Had to. I was trying to fix her, you see. Thought I was helping. Thought my love could sand down her rough edges, polish her into something more palatable. The last thing she said, I'm not your rehabilitation project. I'm a fucking masterpiece of mistakes. She was right. So here's what I want to know. And think carefully before you answer, because this might be the most important question anyone ever asks you. What part of yourself have you been trying to kill? What gorgeous monster have you been keeping locked in the basement? What spectacular flaw have you been apologizing for when you should have been celebrating it? Because here's the truth that hides behind all that self-improvement propaganda. The things that make you difficult to love are the only things worth loving. Anyone can fall for perfection. It takes courage to love a beautiful disaster. It takes even more courage to be one. Your scars aren't wounds, they're autographs. Sign your name on this world with every broken, bent, beautifully damaged piece of yourself. The perfect people? They're background noise. But you, with your stutters and missing fingers and journals full of mistakes, you're the symphony. The last Buddhist monk to leave the monastery at Dharamshala didn't announce his departure. No grand speeches, no ceremonial disrobing. He simply folded his robes one morning, placed them on his meditation cushion like a resignation letter written in saffron, and walked down the mountain. The other monks found a note. Enlightenment was the prison. Leaving is the liberation. They still tell that story, whispered like heresy in the meditation halls, because it reveals the secret that threatens every institution built on human need. The door was never locked. We just forgot we could leave. I'll tell you about power, real power, not the kind they sell in leadership seminars, where middle managers learn to optimize their LinkedIn profiles. Power is Miguel, the janitor at Goldman Sachs, who one Tuesday morning set down his mop in the middle of the marble lobby, took off his uniform shirt, and walked out. Still had 17 years until retirement. Still had a mortgage. Still had a daughter in college. But he'd calculated something the investment bankers with their Hermes ties and cocaine habits hadn't. The cost of staying was compounding faster than any interest rate. They found my mop right there, he told me later, pointing to a spot on his garage floor where he now restores motorcycles. Still standing up, like a monument to every man who ever died at work but kept showing up. Schopenhauer understood this, the old pessimist with his poodles and his fury. He wrote about the will to life, that blind, stupid force that keeps us grinding forward like insects toward light, even when the light is a bug zapper. But he missed the corollary, the will to leave, the sudden, glorious recognition that every chain is voluntary, every cage has a door, every toxic relationship continues only with your daily permission. A 2025 study from the Institute of Behavioral Dynamics tracked cortisol levels in men during major life transitions. The highest stress didn't come from divorce papers or job loss. It came in the months before leaving, when they were still performing happiness, still pretending the fire wasn't burning. But here's the beautiful data point. Cortisol dropped to baseline within 72 hours of walking away. The body knows what the mind resists. Staying is the stress. Leaving is the cure. But we're trained from birth to be good dogs, aren't we? Sit, stay, roll over, play dead. Here's your treat. A paycheck, a wedding ring, a mortgage that feels like a leash dressed up as achievement. We mistake duration for virtue, as if suffering nobly is somehow better than refusing to suffer at all. The Stoics had a practice called premeditatio malorum, imagining loss before it happens. But they got it backwards. We should practice premeditatio liberum, imagining freedom before we take it. Picture yourself walking out of that office, leaving that dinner party mid-sentence, hanging up the phone while she's still listing your failures. Feel the vertigo of possibility, the terror of unscripted existence. I knew a surgeon, let's call him David, who walked out during an operation, not from negligence. His colleague was there. The patient was stable. But halfway through suturing, he saw his life with the clarity that only comes under surgical lights. 40 more years of this, fixing bodies while his own soul necrosed. He finished the critical part, handed the needle to his assistant, and said, "I'm done." Not with the surgery, with surgery. They called him irresponsible, selfish, mad. He sells handmade furniture now in Vermont, sleeps 8 hours, remembers his dreams. His hands, which once cut through human tissue with mechanical precision, now coax beauty from walnut and cherry wood. Irresponsible to whom? He asked me, running his fingers along a table he'd spent 3 months perfecting. To the system that was eating me alive? I owed it nothing but my absence. Here's what they don't teach in couples counseling or corporate retreats. Every moment you stay, after you know you should leave, you're teaching the world exactly how much abuse you'll accept. You're setting your price, and it's always on sale. The market responds accordingly. Kierkegaard wrote about the leap of faith, but faith is easy compared to the leap of departure. Faith promises rewards. Departure promises nothing except the absence of what's killing you. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything. The ancient art of seppuku, ritual suicide, was considered the honorable exit for samurai who had lost face. But what if we've been committing seppuku in slow motion? Every day, we stay in situations that demand we gut ourselves for others' comfort. What if the real honor is in refusing to hold the blade? You know the moment. We all have it. 3 a.m. Clarity. When the veil drops and you see your life as it really is. Not the story you tell at parties, but the raw footage. The relationship that's become a hostage situation where you're both captors and prisoners. The job that pays you just enough to forget you're dying. The family dynamics that require you to perform a version of yourself that expired decades ago. But morning comes, and with it, the 100 reasons to stay. The sunk cost fallacy dressed up as wisdom. I've invested so much already. Yes. And gamblers use the same logic at slot machines, pulling the lever one more time, because surely, the next pull will justify all the previous losses. It won't. So here's my question, and I want you to feel this in your bones, in that place where truth lives before we murder it with logic. What would you lose if you left right now? Not the story you tell yourself, the actual, tangible losses. Now subtract from that what you lose by staying. Your hours, your energy, your dwindling reservoir of gives a fuck. Your one wild and precious life spent as an extra in someone else's drama. The math is always clearer than we pretend it is. The monk who left Dharamshala? They say he became a taxi driver in Delhi, drives through chaos, chooses his passengers, goes home when he's tired. No enlightenment, no transcendence. Just a man who remembered that the most profound spiritual practice is knowing when to leave. And that's the revolution they don't want you to discover. Every system that depends on your suffering requires your consent. Your presence is your vote. Your staying is your signature on the contract. The door was never locked. You just forgot you could leave.